Welcome to Lafayette We're Here, the French history podcast for the American public by a Frenchman. I'm your host, Emmanuel Dubois, and today we have a special episode. I am joined by Sean J. McLaughlin, and together we're going to discuss Charles de Gaulle, John F. Kennedy, and the New World Order. So Sean, why don't you introduce yourself to the listeners?
Yes, I guess I'm technically now a Canadian-American, a hyphenated hybrid of the two. So born and raised in Canada, and I've been working in the United States for about the last decade. So I was a history professor for many years, and my wife and I moved down to a bucolic town in western Kentucky, not too far from Nashville. I drive by horse farms on my way to work, and at this particular juncture, I run the archives at a university, Murray State University, and also a museum. So, but I am still very much a historian at heart, and this particular topic about France and the United States, the two greatest frenemies, I think, in the Western world, it's always captured my imagination, and I guess I've been working on this topic since I was a master's student a little over 20 years ago. And I think part of it is, the tension between English and French, having grown up in Canada, referendums. And, if I sat down with a therapist, I'm sure I would figure it all out very quickly why this topic is so important to me.
Yeah, it is certainly interesting. And yeah, the frenemies is a good way to describe the relationship between the French and the Americans, that's for sure. I arrived in Canada in 95, right a few months before the referendum, so I went through it. We didn't know what to expect, we just arrived, we were French immigrants. In the end, nothing really changed, from at least from a geopolitical standpoint. But still, it was an interesting experience, especially coming from France, which has a whole different way of managing its territory, let's put it this way. So, but here we're going to talk about events that happened a bit before that. So, Sean, just to give the listeners like a basis to work with, can you give us like a quick description of France's place as a colonial power at the outcome of the Second World War?
Okay, well, I think the best place to start is by explaining that the men who ran France in 1945, 1946 are generally born in the late 19th century. And when they're thinking of France as a great power, they're thinking about, far-flung colonies. That's part of the identity of being a great power. So there's this 15-year transitional period, basically the life of the Fourth Republic, where you have men of a certain age trying to cling to an older view of what it means to be an important country in the world. And de Gaulle is very much one of them in 1946 when he's heading up the Provisional Republic. And he, over this period, he sort of transitions into as he becomes older, he becomes more modern in his thinking about what it takes to be important. And that old thing, the colonies, becomes significantly less important than possession of nuclear weapons. And so by the early 1960s, France is a nuclear power. It's a new age great power. Divested of its colonies in Africa and in Asia, still important in a different way. One of the most important countries in the Western Alliance, very troublesome for Americans to deal with for a variety of reasons. But possessing an incredible knowledge of the peoples of this like nascent third world. And I think like if we're kind of looking at France in 1960, I think the most interesting perspective it has is, what it's like to be under the German jackboot and to be colonized, to be an oppressed people. So there's that kind of lingering memory from the Second World War. And it's also combined with this desire to stay relevant and to kind of show some sympathy towards the peoples of the Third World and use the expertise that France has ruling them as a means of staying relevant to the United States. So they're kind of a mélange of of different currents of thought going forward. But France could be an incredibly useful ally to the United States if used properly. But Americans kind of really have a great deal of difficulty taking France seriously for reasons that are, in some respects, understandable, in some respects that are completely unfair. So it's a country that's very badly stereotyped. And I think, I have not spent nearly as much time in France as I would have liked. But, when you go there as an outsider, like as a tourist, and you look at the country, you could say, okay, well, this is a country that does fashion. This is a country that does cosmetics. This is the thing that does showy things, feminine things. Or you could say, this is a country that, you get out a little bit in the countryside. You say, this is a country that's like very much rooted in the earth, in agriculture, and very rooted in automaking and manufacturing. And it could be, is France a masculine country or a feminine country? Well, no, it's not either. It's a country. It's a neutral country. It does many different things at the same time. But if you're an American looking at the country, you tend to make one of two choices, and it tends to be in 1945 all the way through 1960 or so, you tend to take the more derogatory, feminized version of France, which is not fair. But it's a reality.
It is. And, I talked about that on my episode, like on the fall of France of 1940, that there is a perspective that they are surrender monkeys, that they would just drop their rifles and run at the first sign of a German soldier, which is complete, BS. It's
De Gaulle was winning tank battles against Heinz Guderian, who is the greatest tank general the Germans have. Now the front is collapsing all around him, but there are pockets of success and pockets of optimism.
Yeah, and as you said, you cannot stereotype a country to a couple of point of views. France is many things, and I tend to say that France has been around for basically 1,000 years, so they must be doing a couple of things right, otherwise they would have just disappeared. But of course they did a lot of wrong, and we're gonna go into that also. And it is what you said at the beginning. It is true that France and the USA have a unique relationship. I don't see any other two countries in the world that have that very special link dating back to the origin of one of the two countries. The participation of France in the American Revolutionary War is pretty known. There's a reason why this podcast is called Lafayette, We're Here. So it does have that love-hate relationship, because in the 20th century, America becomes the dominant power and France stops being a dominant power. And I recall I had a teacher that would say that France in the 50s and 60s and 70s realized that the French leaders were not stupid, but they still had the reflexes and the knowledge of a great power. And they used that knowledge and those reflexes, because they could see things, they could understand things going in the world better than other countries because of their past experience. And the problem is their main ally, the USA, would not always listen to them for the reasons that you just said. I think, that there is some prejudice. There's also some, legitimate questioning. You just don't take the advice at face value. You have to question it. That's perfectly understandable. But there is also that view that France is a weaker power, that is, I can't put it, it's spiraling down, which, is a bit of it's not a good understanding of the situation. So I think De Gaulle embodies this perfectly, because as you just said, at the outcome of World War II, he is a very traditionalist man in this point of view of France and the rest of the world. But the interesting thing about De Gaulle is that he evolves, he changes as he gets older, which is not that common when you think about it. People tend to do the opposite as they get older. And that's one thing I talked a lot about in my episode on De Gaulle, is that he changes, and because of that, some people saw him as a traitor, because he would change his mind on France's part in the world. He would go from being pro-empire, pro-colonies to say, well, that's not the way to do things anymore. And a lot of French people had a problem with that, especially, ministers or other important figures in France. So let's talk about when de Gaulle becomes president in France in 1958. He's president, France has a new republic, the Fifth Republic, which she still has today. Basically created by de Gaulle for de Gaulle. He made the constitution around himself. Let's put it this way, the French president has a lot of power, more than in most democracies, but he's elected directly by the people. It's, direct election. There is no electoral college in the way the French president is elected. So how complicated is de Gaulle's relationship with the USA and the various administrations he encounters? He starts with Eisenhower, then he has Kennedy, then Johnson.
Well, he actually, he's a colleague of Dwight Eisenhower, right? Like they're both career military men. They're both heads of state, and on paper, Eisenhower is an American version of de Gaulle, and de Gaulle is a French version of Eisenhower. They should be able to get along very easily, one would think. Now, over the course of the war, there are, various sources of annoyance. There's the issue of, should the United States work with certain Vichy officials that are kind of dabbling with the idea of turning on the regime, or should they go with de Gaulle, who has never surrendered, never turned his back on the struggle? And, there's this feeling, so the Americans, they flirt with too many different people when they had one, inspiring leader in front of them, which was a mistake. And there's this feeling for the advisors of both Eisenhower and for Kennedy that de Gaulle will never forgive us for this, for just not picking him from the outset. And there's this very sensitivity to past policy that a lot of the men of the late 50s and early 60s, mid 60s weren't responsible for, but they were very kind of conscious of this kind of awkward wartime relationship. Now, de Gaulle does come to the United States. He does a state visit, very popular. His approval ratings in the United States are quite high. He's viewed as somebody who, he's a strong figure. He's a genuine war hero. He's a unifier. Americans think he's going to be good for France. They think he's going to be good for NATO, the Western Alliance. But when de Gaulle is meeting with Eisenhower, there's one thing that he wants that seems fairly reasonable on paper. Americans call it tripartitism, and for de Gaulle, he called it directoire, like a directorate. So basically, NATO is this, it's not quite a sprawling alliance that it would later become at this point, but you have sharks and you have minnows within NATO. And the reality in 58, 59, 1960 is that, the United States and France and Britain can both project power overseas. They are like the three strong members of NATO. And de Gaulle looks at this alliance and he said he's seeing France being reduced to the same role as Italy. No disrespect to Italy, problematic past, not the same cash in the world. In Belgium, so he feels like his country has been relegated unfairly to a second tier. And so his suggestion to the Americans is, and particularly by the point when France and Britain are on the cusp of becoming nuclear powers, there are also, two of the other 5 members of the UN Security Council. So he says, look, NATO is a big alliance with many countries. However, before we go to the table with anything, or before you go to the table with anything, perhaps sit down with London, sit down with Paris, and we'll hash things out first. It'll be like a 3-way agreement, and then we'll take our shared position to the rest of NATO. And essentially, we're going to kind of massage how decisions are made and then have everyone else approve what we've done. Now, from a French perspective, this is very, there's obviously a first tier, and then there's a high second tier. And then there's a third tier. And unfortunately, Canada is part of that distant third tier. Okay, it's just a reality. So it makes sense for the top 3 at the top of the pyramid to be talking. But from an American perspective, if we give France this, then we're going to offend the Italians, we're going to offend the Belgians, we're going to offend the Dutch, and we'll make one partner happy, and then we'll make 8 completely alienated. So they just instead of, the thing that's infuriating for de Gaulle is he's presented an idea, he's explained why he wants it, and told the Americans what the logic is and how it's meant to function, and the Americans never say yes or they say no. And they leave it to drag on to the end of the Eisenhower presidency. And so when there's this presidential transition, Kennedy comes in, and de Gaulle hasn't heard a no yet. So he just thought, okay, well, I'll try again with the new guy. And this process drags out for a couple of months. And the Americans have never had any intention of giving him what he wanted. And if they'd simply said, your idea is a non-starter from the very beginning, I think it would have made it easier for him to pivot to something else and just accepted that defeat and moved on to other diplomatic priorities. But that's wildly annoying to the French government, wildly annoying and disrespectful, frankly. Now, one of the infuriating things is later when Eisenhower says, in his post-presidency, he says, if I was in de Gaulle's position, I would have asked for the exact same thing from an American president. I totally understood what he was doing and why, and it seemed reasonable. I just didn't want to give it to him. So, that's where we are. And it's kind of, in a sense, there's really, like, the relationship kind of doesn't really recover from that. It's, you've asked for something that should be easy to just, it doesn't cost you anything really, but it does make me feel better about myself, but you won't give it to me. It creates a lot of hurt.
It's like the ego of the nation stops the nation from doing the right thing, even for herself. It was not necessarily a bad thing for the Americans. It just, but I get their point. You don't want to make the rest of the Europeans unhappy.
Yeah.
That's a rational opinion, and, one that should be brought in context. But you cannot just ignore the other guy. You have to give him an answer. Otherwise, as you said, it's disrespectful. And it starts the relationship very badly until de Gaulle is president, at least, of France.
Yeah. So one of the things the Americans get hung up on is Eisenhower thinks that to give in to this request, it's creating a layer of bureaucracy within NATO. And then later, de Gaulle says, no, I just wanted to talk. I just wanted us to get 3 foreign ministers at a table talking before summit. It was going to be much looser and more informal than you thought. So they can't hash it out. And it's in my view, it's a reasonable request. Particularly, the French conception is, Britain's been heavily engaged in South Asia for over a century. We've been heavily engaged in huge swaths of Africa. We have expertise we bring to the table. The United States has had, very limited contact with Africa prior to decolonization, very limited contact with Southeast Asia during the colonial period. So we have no intention of interfering in Latin American affairs. We'll consider that the American backyard. And, each kind of member of this directorate would have its own area of expertise that would bring to the other two for discussion. So that was the way it was supposed to go, but never happened.
As you said, it's logical. You should take the expertise of your allies. It's a good thing for you and for the whole alliance. But then again, it also kind of makes sense for the Americans to want to impose their point of view, because in the 50s, in their mind, there is no question. They're the leaders of the Western world and of the free world. And I don't know if they feel threatened in any way by the other powers like France or Britain, on their own prestige in the world. But you can see they can be defensive, the American leaders, even though they are in a position of force. I mean, neither France or Britain are even close to American power. As you said, they're important military powers. They can project their strength overseas, which most countries can't. But still, it's tiny compared to the American behemoth. But as you said, they do have expertise. They do have knowledge of the world that the Americans just don't have, because America was never a colonial power, at least not on the same scale as France and Britain. So it's one of the, you could say, positives of the colonial era is that it does bring knowledge of the world, even if it was acquired in the most terrible way.
Just to kind of underline that point, in 1941, at the time of the Pearl Harbor attack, there were 3 Americans who spoke Vietnamese. So when the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which is the forerunner of the CIA, when it goes looking for agents to parachute into the country to liaise with Ho Chi Minh and like the anti-Japanese rebels, it's a very short list of candidates for them to interview, right? Because this is, it's part of the French-speaking world. There's virtually no American contact with Vietnam in 1941. Like, literally none at all beyond these three guys. And then 20 years later, it suddenly becomes the most important part of, like, the pivot point of all of Asia. So I think, there's something to the argument that, 80 years into our time in Vietnam, it ended poorly. The commercial ties remain, educational ties remain, political ties remain. We have left. However, we can still put ourselves at your service. This argument from France, it's should have been more persuasive than it was, which I find, this is why I find this subject so interesting. So when we get to John F. Kennedy, when he arrives on the scene, okay, so like there's been 2 years of Eisenhower and de Gaulle kind of circling each other, not satisfying the other's needs as a head of state. Transition, period of excitement. And JFK has very low esteem of France. And some stuff I found in Boston when I was working on my first book. He spent a lot of time in France. He was actually in France in the late 30s for a while. And his diary is just full of just negative, every little thing. But the French have cabbage breath, and the stoves don't work properly, and everybody's trying to rip me off when I want to. It's just, he's on holidays, and it's just like a diary of horrible things that are happening to me in this vacation paradise. And it just seems a little bit hyperbolic, and you kind of wonder what's going on with him. Like there's something reflexive inside of him. Like he just, I don't know, you don't know where he picked it up. We all have racist uncles who say things at the Thanksgiving table, and then, unfortunately a brother or sister repeats them. You feel like that's kind of what's going on with him in France. But so he doesn't like France at all. He's no fan of the Algerian War. He thought that the French had totally screwed up the war in Indochina, and says so. Speeches from the Senate are just very, anti-French, or certainly undiplomatic, words towards an ally. But de Gaulle, he kind of he captivates Kennedy's imagination because he's proud. He's physically imposing. He was, he was a tank commander. Like he was a genuine war hero. He never surrendered. His reputation wasn't stained with Vichy. And so Kennedy very much, and there's a generation gap, like a very big generation gap. So Kennedy is looking to de Gaulle and this, new Fifth Republic that he has, and he's somewhat optimistic that with this new leader, new generation coming in on the American side, that there could be a turning point in Franco-American relations. Now, in Paris, de Gaulle looks at Kennedy and he thinks, this guy's, he's young, he's a bit of a playboy, but he went to Harvard. He's a genuine war hero, PT Bill 109. And I'm kind of interested in seeing whether he brings a fresh perspective to the relationship. So they both hope that things are going to go well. And it's my belief, in my research, that the first foreign head of state that Kennedy reached out to was de Gaulle. And he sent him a letter. So this, the thing that kind of quickly emerges is de Gaulle sees Kennedy as somebody who is Harvard educated but has an undergraduate's, depth of interest in certain problems. Like you read one book and then you repeat that author's argument and then you figure, you've got it all sorted. So Kennedy sends this long letter. I believe it was written by him personally, not kind of translated through an advisor. And so Kennedy, the Belgian Congo it's in flames. Kennedy has a bunch of ideas he thinks are going to fix the problem. And so he sends this letter to de Gaulle. And it's very much look at how brilliant I am. My first week on the job, I'm totally going to fix like one of the biggest international hotspots. And just kind of rubber stamp this. You give me your seal of approval and then we'll go get her done, right? And so the letter comes to de Gaulle, and de Gaulle says, I'm very flattered. I'm very honored for you to reach out to me. However, according to international law, this won't work. According to the terms of the alliance, also manpower, logistics, all this. In the end, it's very impractical. Let's keep talking. This was a great letter. Thank you. And here's my letter back to you. And my read on it was, de Gaulle was somewhat surprised because he found out that Kennedy was a little bit more shallow than he'd been hoping. But he still thought that this would be the beginning of a very long-running conversation on a number of pressing interests of mutual concern. Kennedy seems to have taken it personally. And he totally forgets all of the positive views he had of de Gaulle before he started writing the letter, and then he immediately reverts back to his stock anti-French prejudices of the 30s, 40s, and 50s. So if that's all it took is one polite letter to kind of throw him back a step, then that was, that's his natural position. His natural position was to be adversarial to France.
And it's the complete opposite of de Gaulle. De Gaulle had skin thick as a tank. He took nothing personally, that man, even we should have. He was known to never show emotion, or very rarely show emotion. I talked a lot about that in my episode about him. Even when he gets shot at, he basically doesn't react. And I used to say, when de Gaulle was a young man in the trenches in World War I, imagine being 2 meters tall in a trench. You're the target. And yet, he showed courage, he charged, he was even reckless at times. So it's a huge difference between the two men. And as you said, Kennedy was way more emotional. And, it's part of his qualities too, because he brought that, which is more modern, if you will. He brought that modernity to the presidency. And de Gaulle was way more classic. But I think also, I want to be unfair to JFK, but at this point in their lives, de Gaulle is probably more wise than JFK is. Has more experience, he's calmer. And what I find funny, though, is even though Kennedy has all these prejudices against the French, he marries Jacqueline Bouvier. It's, when you think about it, it's just plain funny.
That is an interesting one, because he was quite happy in his bachelorhood. However, there were many people around him that suggested that, look, if you're a single man in D.C. into your 30s, there's going to be a whisper campaign against you. So if you want to make a run for the White House, you're going to have to pick somebody. And that's who he picked. So, but, I guess there's a question of, the thing that we'll never know about Kennedy is, what would have happened had he got a second term. He certainly does feel, and my book is very critical of Kennedy's decision making in Vietnam. I think as a person, however, there are many admirable traits. He was essentially physically disabled. He had an experimental back surgery in the 1950s, and there were points, the stuff you read about him, all his doctors said, just take it easy for the rest of your life. Your family has money. Just spend your time on your boat, on the beach. Don't put yourself in high-stress situations. He couldn't even pick his kids up. His back was so messed up. The rocking chairs in the White House, that was because it was the only thing he could sit in comfortably. And, he couldn't even board. There were days when his back was so bad, he couldn't even walk up the steps to get onto Air Force One. They had to use a cherry lift, a cherry picker, to physically lift him up. And the cables they sent over to the American Embassy in Paris before his state visit in the spring of 1961, it was all the plane trip is going to completely exhaust him. He needs to have a bath at this temperature. He needs to have this many of these cold beers within reach of the bathtub. It's going to be a day of, we all need a recovery day after flying, but he was just totally gassed. It was a different level. So, he wanted the job, and he pressed himself beyond perhaps his physical limits. I think he showed an incredible potential for growth. I think his second term would have been much better than his first. If we look at, his record on civil rights, he starts off disinterested, and then he gets persuaded to get involved through his brother, and then eventually starts taking more forceful actions. I think, very young guy, just maybe possibly too young to be president. And I think if he'd got his feet under him in a second term, a little bit more maturity, he would have got better with time. But that being said, it just there was the thing that I find in French-American conversations in the early 60s is the French are presenting ideas about policies, and the Americans who are listening to them aren't thinking, they're not discussing the merits of the ideas. They're just talking about the people who are talking to them and their mannerisms and what they did during the war 20 years earlier and why that should disqualify them from giving advice. So there's this intentional self-distraction that comes into play in most of Kennedy era, diplomatic interactions with the French, which is very disappointing, I find.
They look at the packaging more than the package, which it is damaging, as you said. We can understand the reasons, but it's too bad that they could not go past that, especially 20 years after the war, 15 years after the war. And it's very interesting what you said about Kennedy, because, as you said, he is young, and, he dies after only 3 years on the job. It's not like he had a whole lifetime of experience. I mean, De Gaulle has been here for longer. He's been a head of state in 45, 47 during the Provisional Republic, and he's been around for a longer time. He's way older than Kennedy, so you would expect him to, he has way more baggage. So you would expect him to have this wiser approach, and so it kind of makes sense. And it's too bad that Kennedy had these prejudices, but then again, you understand that he might have been able to grow past them, but he never really got the chance. And speaking of evolving, De Gaulle is a good example of that, because as we said, in 45, 47, he has a very classic point of view on French colonies, and let's focus on French Indochina, which is composed of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, which has been a French colony since the end of the 19th century, basically. And as the listeners may know, in the 1950s, there is a war over there against the forces led by Ho Chi Minh, long story short. And in 54, the French lose. They lose the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, and they have to recognize the independence of their former colonies. And De Gaulle, if you had asked him the question in, 48, should France defend her colony to the last man, he would have said yes, no questions asked. But in 53, 54, he should have said, or he would have said, we should have discussions with them. His thinking evolved, because as you said, his thinking evolves towards, that's not the way to be a power right now. You don't want to have colonies. You need to have technology, you need to have the nuclear power, and you need to have the means to use that power. And then when he becomes president, he works towards that. So his thinking about the French colonies and Indochina in particular evolves a lot, and then it shows in Algeria, because at first, of course, he wants to preserve the thing, but then he understands there is no way to preserve this, so we have to accept the fact as they are, and we have to give Algeria its independence, which will happen in 1962. And the problem is that in Indochina, there are other parties interested, and the Americans are the main one, because, we're in the Cold War, and Ho Chi Minh is a communist. And now we have this Northern Republic, which is a communist country, and we have first the state of Vietnam, and then the Republic of Vietnam, which is South Vietnam. And, after the French leave, we have this situation where the Americans basically take over the French. And as you said, they don't heed the French advice at all. They think they can do better. They think they can do what the French failed to do, which is basically to remove the communists from the country. So it starts before Kennedy, but it gets way bigger under Kennedy. Can you explain to us how Kennedy's administration handled the situation in Vietnam when he arrives?
Yeah, there's, basically over 2.5 years, there's this massive increase in the number of American military advisors who are in the country. So, towards the end of the Eisenhower presidency, there are a few hundred American advisors, and there's aid money flowing in, but it just explodes dramatically in 2.5 years. So, is America part of a hot war in Vietnam in 1963? Well, technically, legally, no. However, you have American advisors going into the field with South Vietnamese units that are hunting partisans. And if they're fired at, they'll fire back. Americans are dying in South Vietnam on John Kennedy's watch. So it's a maybe I was going to say slow motion march to war, but the tempo is a little bit faster than that. And de Gaulle sees all this happening. So, for him, the exit was a little bit easier to stomach from Vietnam than Algeria because it's not a settler colony per se. And, this quintessential battle that ends the French era, Dien Bien Phu, it just underlines how much French planners had underestimated their enemy when they picked the location of the decisive battle and they ceded the high ground, and on the assumption that there's no way that the Vietnamese partisans would be able to haul their artillery up the hill. And no, they couldn't haul their artillery up the hill. However, they could take it apart down to the nut, reassemble it from the high points. And so there's learning from that defeat. The other thing that's absolutely terrifying to both the French and the British is how the Eisenhower administration casually offered France the use of a tactical nuclear weapon in 1954 for use in Vietnam against the Viet Minh. And they can't believe that this offer was even put forward, because there's something to be said, there's a long debate about the morality of dropping it against Japan in 1945. But there's no justification whatsoever for resorting to such a drastic step. And this scares France, this idea of like a loose nuclear war in the bush at some place in the third world. So there's a sit down between JFK and de Gaulle in Paris in the spring of 1961. And there are many topics to discuss. Vietnam is one of them. And the point that de Gaulle makes, you get readouts from this in DDF, the French diplomatic documents, and Frus, and then you'll find more items in presidential libraries. You can fill your boots with readings on this. But the French point is this: the more you push in Vietnam, the more you force Moscow and Beijing to push back. And this is no longer, no one is really thinking about what's best for the Vietnamese or listening to the Vietnamese. It's all about a contest between the two. And you're going to end up destroying this country to prove a point to one another, the three superpowers. And you're going to have the same result that we did after 7 years of war. So de Gaulle has suggested very early on in the Kennedy presidency, let us be your honest lawyer here. We'll see if we can get people talking instead of fighting. And it may take a period of time, but ultimately the goal should be for the Vietnamese to determine a Vietnamese future on their own. And if they're neutral, that should be good enough for us. It should be good enough for the communists. Just so long as they're not armed and threatening their neighbors, then so be it. We can walk away, job done. And so this is the point. It's very simple. And all of his high-ranking officials, they spent 2.5 years, basically repeating this line to every American counterpart they can find. And they try politeness. They try to find sympathetic ears. And the argument, it's not heard. It's not. There's no. That's an interesting perspective. Why don't you try that track? And we'll continue the military aid and the military training, and we'll pursue the two in tandem. And if diplomacy provides an exit, we'll take it. If the military situation changes and we can win on the ground, that'll provide us an exit. We'll basically play it by ear. There's just really no interest in pursuing the diplomatic track, and the results are as catastrophic as de Gaulle would have predicted, which is really unfortunate. When I was writing, there's pressure from certain people to like, okay, in your framing of this, you have to both sides it. Okay, you have to think about like the merits of what one is saying and the merits of what another is saying. But I tend to, unfortunately, be a little bit more black and white, and I just say, like, in hindsight, one party to this conversation was 100% right, and one party was 100% wrong. So I don't really feel the need to pick apart the argument that was right that went unheeded by people with power who went and completely shredded 3 countries in Southeast Asia. So I guess this question about what to do in Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia, it's a chapter in Franco-American relations, but it's just a really tragic chapter in world history, in 20th century history. Just a very avoidable catastrophe for all countries involved.
Yeah, and do you think, and I mean, there is all the prejudice against France, as you mentioned before, and they're basically not heeding the advice because it comes from France. So that's the main reason.
Yeah.
But do you think also there's like an overconfidence in Americans on power and capacity of solving everything with basically having the bigger gun?
Well, there is considerably more optimism in the United States than in many other Western countries, and at this point, it's because we're Roosevelt New Dealers. We fixed the Great Depression through bureaucracy. We won World War II. We were the arsenal of democracy through bureaucracy. When we get all these Ivy League brains together, there really isn't any. If we can win World War II, how are we not going to win a Bush war in Southeast Asia, right? So it's not as delusional and overly confident as you might think at the time. But what I find really tragic in all of this is that France is not saying anything to the Americans that pretty much every other serious member of the Western Alliance thinks. The British feel exactly the same way, and they're too cowardly to tell the Americans as directly as France does. Canada feels exactly the same way as the French do. The West Germans feel the exact same way as the French do. Now, it's just out of just a sense of trepidation about how the Americans will react to hearing bad news, they all remain silent. Now, if they had added their voices, and if 5 of the most serious NATO members all went to the United States together and said, look, we have no interest in being drawn into World War III in Southeast Asia because you have decided that Vietnam must remain in the anti-communist camp, maybe that would have affected a different outcome. It doesn't happen. And so, I admire the French position. It was right in the end, but I think the French were very much let down, predictably let down. Because you look at all the diplomacy towards Germany after World War I, and the Brits immediately forget that they had fought with France. It's kind of a pattern of the Anglo-Saxon powers to work with France when they have to, and then kind of forget that they're supposed to be friends in peacetime as well.
Yeah, it's a really weird relationship. I mean, for the British and the French, I can understand because we've been allies for now over a little bit over a century. We've been at each other's throats for 8 centuries, so there is some baggage there. So I can get the sentiment that we can't trust these frogs. They're not trustworthy because we've been at war so many times over the past centuries. So I can get that, and trust me, the French don't trust the British that much more. So it's a reciprocal sentiment. As for the Americans, it's funny because they've always been allies with France. The closest they've been to a conflict is a quasi-war. So they've never been at war with each other. They've always been on the same side during war. So it's really based on cultural prejudices, which is fascinating when you think about it, because it's completely avoidable. And I find interesting that you mentioned that the other NATO powers just would not come on the stage and say, look, we agree with France, we think the same way. You have 5, 10, 20 voices here saying the same thing, hear us. And I get why they would not talk. You're basically saying, at this point in, let's say, 1960, 61, 62, the USA are seen as the boss of the Western world. So you're saying to your boss, you're wrong. It's not an easy thing to do. So it's, I don't want to judge them. But the thing is, when we talk about France, and especially when we talk about de Gaulle had no conception of having a boss, I think. It shows during the war, because he always, and it's logical, to be heard when you don't have the same power, you have to talk and act as if you had the same power, as if you're on the same plane as your opponent or your ally. He talked to Churchill as he had an army the same size as he did in 1942, even though he had pretty much nothing. He talked to JFK as he was an equal. He snubbed him, as is famously known when he came to Paris. He talked with Jackie about French cinema and movie and novels more than he talked about diplomacy at some point, which infuriated JFK apparently. But it's to make a point. You're not more important than I am. We're both presidents, we're both state leaders. We're in the same camp, you have to respect that. And I think he understood that the Americans did not respect that at that point, at least when it came to France. So he had to make the point. And he was very consistent in that approach. So you mentioned the Kennedy approach here. As we all know, Kennedy dies in 1963, is assassinated. And we have Johnson that replaces him. Is there any major shift when Johnson comes around?
Well, the entire national security team is essentially retained. So, LBJ had been dispatched to South Vietnam on a fact-finding tour. And it created the impression that he was part of the policymaking team. However, LBJ was very much an outsider. He was, he grew up poor. He went to teachers' college. Everybody else in the Kennedy administration, they're all Ivy League educated former executives and university administrators, and they are the elite of the elite. And LBJ was an incredibly skilled politician, and he just felt like he was oil and water with these Kennedy guys, to the point where there was a lot of speculation that he would decline a nomination as Kennedy's vice president for another term. If it had got to that point in 1964, he kind of wanted out. But he relies on Kennedy's guys, and he does, like, it's a traumatic event, like an incredible tragedy that brings him to the White House. And he felt an obligation to continue Kennedy's policy in Vietnam, which, as he understood it, which we all see in front of us, was a steady escalation, growing aid, more trainers, just marching closer and closer to the precipice of actually sending American combat troops over. There's the one subject of historiographical debate is, would Kennedy have committed combat troops to Vietnam had he got his second term? And there are Kennedy fans who say, no, it was he would have done a complete 180. And I don't want to bore you for 45 minutes by name-dropping authors and book titles and such. I don't buy it. I think LBJ basically did what he thought JFK had done had he lived to that point. I'm much more sympathetic to LBJ, the president who wanted to expand access to college and implement all sorts of anti-poverty programs, but then had Vietnam thrust in front of him, than I am for Kennedy, the foreign policy expert, who wanted to become president to solve problems like this and just couldn't see his way around it. The way the de Gaulle team looked at Kennedy is they thought that he was both indecisive and aggressive, which made him very, very dangerous in the world. And when you look at the public statements from Kennedy the last year of his life, it's one day it's Vietnam is an absolute linchpin; it cannot be lost. However, there must be peace with the Soviet bloc. We must turn our swords into plowshares. And at the same time, there's all sorts of plotting against Fidel Castro even after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it's just like, if you only read one set of speeches, you would think, okay, this guy's a great peacenik who's trying to find his way out of the Cold War. And if you read the other set of speeches, it's, well, this guy's an ardent Cold War hawk. He's militaristic, he's aggressive. But it was the same person, and it's really hard to kind of figure out which side of his mouth he was thinking from.
Yeah, and when he was faced with a major crisis like the Berlin Wall or the Cuban Missile Crisis, I mean, to be fair, he was very smart about it. He was not reckless, and he maybe avoided a third world war with catastrophic consequences. And the same man that takes these reckless decisions when it comes to Southeast Asia. So it's very interesting, He's certainly not a dull character. In some parties, he is that Ivy League, very educated man that thinks a lot, that has this education, that uses it to be a good foreign minister, president, if you will.
I got a little vignette for you. Okay, so when Kennedy is an undergraduate at Harvard, he does this like typical undergrad thing where he waits until like 36 hours before his term paper is due before he starts working on it. And he calls his dad, who's like a super rich guy. He says, "Oh man, I am in the weeds. I'm going to fail this course. I need you to do something for me." So his dad hires all these stenographers, sends them to his place in Boston. And so JFK is just, he's on the clock. He's under pressure, pacing around the room, just saying things out loud. And the stenographers are cleaning them up. And then like they get it done. The paper is submitted. He passes. It's a success. But that's kind of where he was at his very best, was like under high pressure. Now, the whole like longer term approach that would avoid those high pressure situations, that's where he was just no good at all, right? But, you know, when it really came down to it, he found a way to steer clear.
Interesting guy, that's for sure. So we have Johnson continuing his work, what he think Kennedy would have done, which makes sense given Johnson's character. And then what happens when we have Nixon coming over? And we're not going to go too long in Nixon because he's after de Gaulle. But, you know, de Gaulle quits the presidency in 69 and dies in 70. Just before we move to Nixon, just a quick parenthesis. What was de Gaulle appreciation of Johnson? Did he had any opinion on him, or did it was like, okay, not that important?
Okay, you put me on the spot here. I believe they only met once, which was at JFK's funeral. And the LBJ assumption was that, you know, my predecessor couldn't make it work. There's no point me even trying. So there's no exchange of letters. There's really limited contact, only the one personal visit, something completely unrelated to diplomacy. So it's just that kind of both sides have given up.
Complete non-starter from the beginning. Okay.
Yeah. So the French are working behind the scenes to get North Vietnamese and South Vietnamese talking. They're doing it very clandestinely behind the scenes in 62, 63. And after the coup against the Diem regime, it essentially kind of brings that activity to a halt. And they go to ground for most of the Johnson years. So there's a pause in their efforts. But when Johnson wants to get peace talks started, he goes back through the French. The French had just been basically waiting to be asked. And as soon as they were asked, they put their good offices to use. And in fact, you know, the deal that LBJ's negotiators basically come to with the Vietnamese communists in 68, right before the election, it's the same deal that Nixon gets at Christmas in 72. But there's a whole bunch of diplomatic intrigue. Is Richard Nixon guilty of treason for undermining this peace deal? I think clearly yes. There's a lot of cloak and dagger stuff. And LBJ, very weirdly, chose not to call out Nixon for his role in sabotaging the peace deal in 68, which was strategically very odd. But anyway, that's a whole different rabbit hole to go down. But de Gaulle actually treated Nixon very well. When Nixon was in political retirement, he flew to Paris. They had a very nice conversation. De Gaulle treated him like a former vice president, like a representative of state. And I think they understood each other much, much better than de Gaulle and either of the two Democratic presidents he had to work with. So, you know, I guess the one interesting counterfactual is if you had de Gaulle and Nixon trying to work together on Vietnam in 61, 62, 63, would they have got a better result? Even though I do think Richard Nixon is a very bad person for many different reasons, I think on this one particular thing, Nixon would have been a heck of a lot more receptive to French advice than Kennedy was, because he doesn't have all those stereotypes and the baggage and all that.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's a good what if. So as you said, France basically tries to be a peace broker in the 60s, and they do help the Americans come to this deal, that failed deal in 68, and then that, in quotes, success of 72. So how would you describe France's role on the international scene since then? As this ex-dominant power that is now a, let's say, relatively important one, but it's still way behind America when it comes to sheer military power and other stuff. But we're still talking about a country with strong ties with many countries, ex-colonies and others, that has a very potent military force, nuclear carrier, a whole fleet. They do their own weapons, aircraft, and all that stuff. It's not nothing. It's a big military power, big economical power. So how would you describe her role now, since the 60s and 70s?
Well, the communist leadership in North Vietnam, for the most part, they're French educated, they're French speaking. If they want to pass a message to the Americans, they want to talk to the French. And they view France as being part of the Western system, but also having a very strong independent streak. When de Gaulle takes France out of the NATO integrated command, that's kind of a shot across the bow to the Americans. So yeah, they do certainly see France as a very useful power. And this is what de Gaulle is hoping for going into the 1930s, that we can be this intermediary between the first world and the third world. And we'll get involved in certain places to help resolve crises. And, it's a good use of the French skill set and diplomatic tradition. And do they ultimately help get the Americans out of Vietnam? Yes. 12 years later than de Gaulle wanted. But, there's an approach to the Americans. Do you want us to get you a diplomatic settlement? In 61, the Americans say no. In 68, the Americans ask them to start helping with the diplomacy. They do. They get a deal. One American politician who's running for president scuppers that deal. That president who scuppered that deal goes back to the French a third time in 1972 and says, hey, that deal that I killed last time, could you maybe revive that for us? And, France is always there, always ready to help. And they do get it done in the end in 72. Yeah, that's generally where I think they're.
Yeah, they do find ways to be useful, at least. That's a positive of that colonial era that they had before, which, can be criticized on many things, but there is knowledge that was acquired. And as you said, France has a long expertise and experience in diplomacy and understanding other countries. And we're talking about, it's pretty easier for the Vietnamese too. They're more used to dealing with the French than anybody else because of the colonial era. So it's maybe easier also to have that relationship to talk together. And it's funny because when you talk about prejudices, you talked before that de Gaulle had this idea of kind of a triumvirate between the Americans, the British, and the French to discuss things at NATO before talking about with everybody else. In France, we have this perspective that important things are discussed over dinner. You set up a table and then you chat, and that's where the real things are discussed. And when we see the Americans, we say, no, they need the proper setup. It has to be staged. It has to be, a big bureaucracy, which did wonders for the Americans, as you said, in 30s and 40s. But from the French prejudice on the Americans is that without all this set up, they can't decide anything. So it works both ways. The French probably have these prejudices that the Americans, can't we just, take a cup of coffee and, discuss this and get it over with. The French like to weasel their way, if you will. It's part of the French character, I guess. And, the Americans probably should have used that skill that they lacked. The rest, being a French guy living in Canada, the prejudice that we have about the Americans, that even if they have good intentions, they come out way too strong. They just, there is no finesse. And it does hurt them in the end. And certainly did in Vietnam, because, as you said, even when they wanted to achieve peace, they needed help to achieve it. They just didn't have the expertise to do it by themselves. So, just to have a last point, since the Vietnam War, it's a traumatic event for the Americans. Even to this day, it's the most polarizing event of the 20th century for America, I think. How would you say the relationship between the USA and France have evolved since then?
Still, it's I think we both have this feeling that when push comes to shove in the moment of crisis, the two will always stand together like they have since 1917. And the drama between the crises is what keeps the relationship spicy and interesting. And I find whenever the politicians start talking about Lafayette and the Statue of Liberty, whenever they have to reach for the metaphors, that's when I think, okay, this is when no listening is about to start happening. And that's when I start to get worried. But when they start talking about what kind of MRAPs need to be sent over to Ukraine and whether it makes sense for France to talk to China to see if China really has any serious interest in doing anything constructive in the Ukraine, in a way that I think that in the crisis mode they work very well together, and they always will continue to work together because of the complementary skill sets.
Yeah, exactly. They are very complementary. I think they're very different, but together they can achieve fantastic things.
So I think it is very, very good. If we're talking about what's happening right now in Ukraine, I think it is very good for the Western alliance to have a squeaky wheel like France, which is big and important and considered to sometimes thumb its nose at the United States. And the president of that country can call the president of Russia, who is a horrible war criminal and deserves to be tried at The Hague and face a Mussolini-like end to his political career. It's good that can happen because no American can make that call, can make that contact. And France can do the same with China. And if it dead ends, like it appears to have ended over the last year, you at least know that there's nobody there on the other end willing to do anything constructive. So I do think they're good dance partners, I will say.
Interesting ones anyway, that's for sure. So before we sign off, can you mentioned your books, so can you tell the listeners a bit about your books and where they can find you if they want to?
So despite this accent, I am a resident of Kentucky, and I've written a couple books for the University Press of Kentucky. The first one was JFK and de Gaulle, how the United States and France failed in Vietnam, 1961 to 1963. Came out in 2019. It's available through the University Press of Kentucky catalog, but I get into all the stuff we discussed here and more. But I think I should not tell you this, however, in the interest of oversharing. International relations and war and peace, it was my first love, but I think I've decided that I will move on to more uplifting topics in future projects. So I've actually got a baseball book in the works about the season that Jackie Robinson, baseball icon, he played as a minor leaguer in Montreal. And all the French speaking baseball fans in Montreal came out in a way that was really heartwarming to support this Black American player who was doing something consequential to help break down Jim Crow and racial segregation. And they all rallied around him. And I think it's a great baseball story. It's a great story about Montrealers. And no one dies, which is the most important thing. So this book is, I'm working on it as we speak. It'll come out with the University of Nebraska Press at some point, probably in 24 or 25.
Nice. Beautiful project. That's a very good idea, and I'm looking forward to reading this.
It will be a hardship having to, I as a researcher, oh no, I have to go to the Foreign Ministry archives in Paris. Or I have to go to Montreal in the summertime for research. I really pick these horrible places to go spend time.
Quelle horreur.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're gonna have a terrible time in both Montreal and Paris.
Yeah.
Horrible cities to visit and worst food ever.
Yeah, no. I do this deliberately. I know what I'm doing here.
No, you're safe. So thank you very much, Sean. It was great having you on the show. We appreciate it that you came over, and it's a great discussion about de Gaulle, John Kennedy, and the New World Order, especially in Southeast Asia. I'm sure the listeners will love this discussion. So, merci beaucoup. Au revoir.
Appreciate you. Thanks for your time.
You can find the Lafayette We Are Here podcast wherever you get your podcasts or on LafayettePodcast.com. If you enjoy the show, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/LafayettePodcast. You can also reach me on social media or by email. All the links are on the website. The music for this podcast is the Marche pour la cérémonie des Turcs, composed by Jean-Baptiste Lully, arranged and performed by Jérôme Arfouche.